So today's story time we'll be looking at the wonderful world of monastic drinking habits, largely outside the monastery here and there, but this is really important because actually it's largely within monasteries that the nature of brewing and drinking changes over the Dark Ages and High Middle Ages, that they are actually the people doing the biggest production of alcohol at all. And this is partly because it's already been set in the rules of the different monasteries and they kind of keep the same set rules. So in the 6th century, the rule of St Benedict became very popular in sorry. The 6th century rule of Benedict became very popular a little bit later, in late Anglo-Saxon England, and that said that a hemina of wine, which is roughly a bottle of wine, should be sufficient per day for each monk. Although the abbot should take into account if it was particularly hot or they'd been working particularly hard, they should be allowed more than one hemina. Benedict himself wasn't actually convinced that wine was a good thing for the monks to drink, but saying that they could have one hemina per day was a sort of compromise. That was considered to be drinking sparingly. Of course, he may be talking about dilute wine, given that that's what a lot of people were still drinking at that point. One may hope so, at least, because if that's the compromise version, then that's a little scary. He also says if the wine isn't available because of the circumstances of the monastery, no one should murmur about it. You know, don't complain if you don't get your wine. And of course, in England, many of the monasteries couldn't grow wine, or their secular donors couldn't grow vines. Some clearly do. In the Domesday Book, there are 38 vineyards in the country, which is thought to be an undercount. Some other people would say that it's likely most monasteries have at least a few vineyards. 9th to the 13th century is a warm period in England, so they would grow in most of the south of the country and Midlands even. And of course they need to have a little bit of wine. They need a few grapes because you need wine for Mass, even though the wine is not being drunk by all members, only by the celebrant priest. Nonetheless, you need some wine. And wine production in England does kind of ramp up with the monastic culture that needs it for that purpose. But it still is rare as a sort of standard drink for people. Alcuin was fond of his wine. Alcuin is a English monk who has moved over to France in about 800 to be advisor to Charlemagne. And on a visit back to England, he laments to one of his friends, "The wine has gone from out the wineskins, and bitter beer ranges in our bellies. And because we have it not, drink in our name and lead a joyful day." So he's saying, you know, I'm stuck here and I've only got beer to drink, but you know, you have access to wine. You drink some wine on me and have a good day for it. On the other hand, the people who prefer beer in England, when they visit the continent, they complain that the beer is much better back in England. So it does seem that, you know, if you want wine, get it from France, and if you want beer, get it from England. And that kind of divide between the two has been around for a very, very long time. Even in France, they couldn't always get hold of the wine they needed. In 843, there's a Paris abbot who complains that there's a grape shortage. He's not happy with anything. He says there's a grape shortage for wine, there are no pears to make perry, there's a shortage of grain for ale, so we're stuck with drinking water. Poor things. And that shows the sort of order of preference there, that he'd have wine if he could, and if not, then perry. No, can't have that. Then ale, can't even have that. Then you're stuck with the water. And in England, we know that that hemina of wine is often replaced with a gallon of ale. It's difficult to know how much that actually means, though, because ales are not all the same strength, and even within the monastery, they're probably not all drinking stuff that's the same strength right throughout the day. Quite commonly, it seems there were 3 different kinds being brewed at the same time, and they wouldn't always be drinking the weakest one. That some people suggest they're drinking like the weakest one at breakfast and then the proper strong one, which could be 10% even in the evening. So it isn't that idea of, oh, it doesn't matter that they lived entirely on wine because it was all small. I've got wine in my head now. That idea that it doesn't matter that they were drinking beer all the time because it was all only small beer, which is barely alcoholic at all, is not entirely correct, because they would drink that sometimes, but in that gallon there would have been some of the strong stuff as well. The first people to embrace this large-scale brewing is the large monastic houses, and the oldest... There's a cat about to hove into view, I apologise. Come here, you. Come here, say hello to your adoring fans. And large-scale monastery brewing is important. The first drawings we have of a proper brewery come from the monastery of St Gall in Switzerland, and actually they are the only detailed architectural plans that exist for anything between the fall of Rome and the year 1400. And it's an idealised plan. The monastery is massively expanded, and a bishop sends plans to the abbot for an ideal monastery, and it's spread across 5 large sheets of parchment with all the different bits of all the layout of what a perfect monastery should have. And we don't know how much of it ever actually got built, but this, shows what they would like. And within that plan for an ideal monastery, there are 3 breweries. One for guests, one for pilgrims and the poor, and one for the monks themselves. And we can't tell whether those are different kinds of beer, whether the quality would be different. The equipment is sort of drawn on the little vat, looks to be the same. One of them has written, "Here let the beer be brewed, the beer for the brothers be brewed," alongside what look like they might be fermenting vessels. And then there's another room with, "Here let the brew be strained," where you can sort of see the troughs for it. And in the kitchen for the guests and for the paupers, the rooms are shown as, "Here let the beer be cooled." And in the monks one, you can sort of see it in detail, that there is a granary and storage bins for malted and unmalted grain. There's a drying kiln, there's a building with a mill in it. It's a whole little, community and industry going on. And the amount of beer they would have to produce to make a gallon for each member every single day, it must be a huge enterprise. You're helping. Yes, you're helping, aren't you? It's probably the monks are the first people that keep it in barrels as well. The first clear reference we have to beer in barrels is a story from the life of St Columban in somewhere I can't pronounce, Luxeuil? Yes, Luxeuil, where it said that the steward put a jug under the beer, pulled the tap, but was then called away and ran back out, leaving the beer overflowing. And when he returned, he expected the barrel would be empty, but he found that miraculously the beer had filled into the jar and then stopped, and not one drop of this beer had been wasted, because God didn't want to punish him for his zeal, because all he had done was go away from his beer to attend a call from Columban. So that was the right thing to do, and therefore he will not be punished for it. Or the plug on the tap got stopped by, the flow got stopped by something, possibly. Another place we can see it in the early monastic life as being important is when you look in all the sign language that they developed. The Benedictines, of course, largely either completely or mostly a silent order, depending which variant they are going on. And therefore they develop different signs for things, important daily life tasks, things. And quite a lot of them are for food and drink. And that includes actions. And I tried to work out how to do them so that I could show them to you, but the actual instructions for them are often really very vague, and I thought I'd probably get them wrong. Like, one of them is rubbing one hand against the other, and the other is rubbing the 2 hands together, and it's like... Anyway, there are actions for things including wine and wine skins. Both of those are in the section on the Mass. And then in the section on the refectory, you also get different signs for strained wine, for beer, and for beer dregs, because these are clearly important things to know. Meanwhile, in a sort of less formal, less organised context, we can go over to the likes of Ireland, where, of course, a slightly different monastic culture is flourishing. And we can look at people like St Bridget, who very much has some alcoholic elements to her story, perhaps because of the association and the bleed through from the pagan Irish goddess of the same name. So, for instance, apparently when her wet nurse was ill, she called for some beer, and when none could be found, she turned some water into beer, gave that to her wet nurse, and her wet nurse got better, because that's what you really need. Another time, she turned her own bath water into some beer and fed it to some lepers, which cured them. The mind boggles. She could also, this ability to just miraculously produce extra beer, she could brew some beer and then multiply it so that it provided for lots of extra people compared to the number it should have done. And there's a 10th century Irish poem attributed to Bridget in which she is asked for her idea of heaven. And one of the things she says in it is, "I'd like to give a lake of beer to God. I should like the angels of heaven to be drinking it forever." So I don't like beer, but that still kind of works, doesn't it? Of course, in this period, a lot of the time, if we're finding out what people are actually doing, it's because they're doing something wrong and drinking too much. So, for instance, in 793, Alcuin writes a letter to the monks of Lindisfarne, and this is shortly after the monastery has been sacked by the Vikings, of course. And Alcuin says that it's their fault because they have blurred the words of their prayers through drunkenness. Nothing like hearing it's your fault when, you've just had your home destroyed and all of them ransacked and all of that. But we know that some of these people certainly were getting drunk enough that it might well blur the words of their prayers. There's a wonderful marginal edition on a 9th century Irish manuscript, and it's written in Ogham, which I assume meant that they thought that the abbot couldn't read that. It's a little sort of private aside, and it translates as "ale killed us." And I don't think he means that, the drunkenness led the Vikings to come over and stab a load of people. I think he means, "Oh God, my head hurts. I drank too much last night. The ale, it's killing me." There are several saints of alcohol, and there are 2 Catholic patron saints of beer. And just to confuse us, they are both called Arnulf. Sometimes one or the other is called Arnold instead, which is supposed to help, but it would only help if you were consistent in which one became an Arnold. They're the same name anyway, really, but Arnulf it is. So Arnold, can't get wrong with that. Arnold of Soissons, or possibly Arnulf, is a 11th century monk who is possibly important in an inventor and technological sense as well. He is credited with inventing beer filtration. Because obviously they're making so much beer, it makes sense to have ways to improve the process, improve the beer easily. And he apparently came up with the idea of passing this beer through a series of woven wicker panels, which he said that he had this idea while making the wicker skeps that the monastery's bees lived in, making the sort of wicker beehives. So that's his real claim to fame. But in the stories, of course, there are other more miraculous events. He's credited with saving hundreds of lives. Not so much a miracle as good medicine, really. He told all of his flock during a plague to drink the beer, not the water. Now, depending what kind of disease it actually was, of course, that could potentially be very helpful. In images, he quite often has a mash rake in one hand that he would use as part of the beer making process. He's also the patron of hop pickers. The rest of his saint's life is brilliant as well, by the way. There's a bit where somebody offers him the role of abbot, and he doesn't want to be abbot, so he runs away from the monastery, and he's chased back by a wolf. So he goes back and says, "Oh, all right, I'll be abbot then." Clearly that wolf is a signal from God. And in Belgium, allegedly, or some places in Belgium, there is a parade on his day because they're that fond of their beer. The other Arnold, or Arnulf, has some fairly similar stories attached to him. St Arnulf of Metz, again, during a plague, is supposed to have submerged his crucifix into a beer kettle and told people to only drink from that beer, and then they would not succumb to the plague. One or the other of them, or possibly both, could also do Bridget's trick of magically multiplying the amount of beer that there was. Arnold of Metz allegedly is responsible for saying, "From man's sweat and God's love, beer came into the world." Now there's someone with a passion. A little bit later than these folks, of course, into the high Middle Ages, there is very much an image in our minds of the drunken monk, like the one in that picture that I put up, who is the cellarer, who is going to be the one who has the keys, as he's got in his hand in that picture, who has access to the drink and can therefore sneak down when he's not supposed to and have a little bit extra. When we think of Friar Tuck in a lot of the visuals of that, he's very much seen as quite fond of a tipple or two, yeah? And certainly, again, some of these bigger monasteries are producing huge quantities of beer. One Yorkshire abbey has been excavated, and they reckon that in about 1500, the brewery had capacity for 120 barrels, and that is over 34,000 pints on the go at one time. Benedictine rule, of course, is at this point settled as 1 pint at each of your main meals. The monks at Canterbury, however, said that, this having been written by St Benedict, this clearly only refers to pints of wine. The rule does not mention beer at all, therefore we can have as much beer as we like. Bearing in mind that beer and wine at this point were, although clearly things that had similar results, nobody had isolated the concept of alcohol, that these are both things that contain the same drug that will have the same effects. So clearly he's talking about whatever it is that's in wine, doesn't mention beer at all. Let's have as much as we like of that. Now, in St Augustine's in Canterbury, each monk drank an average of 2 gallons of beer per day, which is a lot of calories, if nothing else, given that beer was favoured from a very early point as liquid bread, just because it would get a lot of grain down you. One monk there at the time, who presumably is drinking 2 gallons of beer a day, roughly, is a chap called Michael of Northgate, who was writing a book called Aeon Bite of Inwit, which is the prick of conscience. And he's railing against taverns. And taverns are the sort of the secular thing you could do at that time, and they are largely for wine. But if you think of like the tavern in the start of Canterbury Tales, so that's a sort of secular place you can go. And we'll talk more about them next time, I think. And he's saying that they are effectively an anti-church. A church is somewhere you go in with things wrong with you and you come out fixed, whereas a tavern is somewhere you go into walking straight, speaking clearly with the full faculties of reason, and then while you're in there you get drunk and you lose all of those things. So it's the opposite of a church. And he's saying that while still drinking 2 gallons of beer a day himself. The problem of it not being mentioned in the rule of Benedict is echoed in that the Bible really doesn't have that much to say about how drunk you can or should get. Certainly there aren't specific regulations and quantities mentioned, and if there were, then the types of alcohol involved would probably have changed anyway. In the 15th century, Bishop Reginald Peacock argues that because it isn't really mentioned in the Bible, we should therefore use our reason as to when we should stop drinking. The comparison he gives is that we don't need the Bible to tell us when to sit on a toilet, and nor do we need the Bible to tell us when to get back up again. We don't sit on the toilet and then start looking through the Bible trying to find a passage saying, oh, you can stop now, or you should stop now, go on, get up. We use our reason to tell us that it's time to stop and get back off the toilet. Weird, right? But of course, the risk with that method is that the very fact you're having the booze can make you lose your reason. And this is why preachers will turn to things like the biblical story of Lot, who, after he and his daughters have escaped from Sodom and Gomorrah, and his wife has failed to escape, you may or may not know the story that at that point his daughters decide the only way for the family line to continue, and it's very, very important that the family line continues, is if they get him really, really drunk, and he has already planted a vineyard and enjoys his wine, and seduce him, and he doesn't notice that that's what's happening, and they both have his babies. The Bible is full of very, very strange things. So this is clearly, a risk of drinking. But again, that's drinking wine, and wine is that, clearly it's stronger, and it's that foreign muck, and they don't even know it's the same chemical, so that doesn't necessarily prevent you. When I was looking this up, I found the most marvellous thing, which is, I don't know if it still exists, but there used to be a journal called the Journal of Inebriety. And in that, I found an article called Alcoholism in Medieval England, written in 1933. It's a marvellous journal. I want to find some more. All different aspects of inebriation, as we would probably call it now. And that has a couple of examples of monks being criticised for drinking a lot at this time. So, for instance, William of Malmesbury says that the monks at Bath at one point prolonged their banquet into the night and carried on drinking until dawn. And also that they had a certain abbot called Brichtwald who died in a drinking bout, and they buried him in a marsh. And the theory is they buried him in a marsh because he died extremely sinful and drunk, and it could possibly be considered self-inflicted, and the marsh is to stop him getting back up again and walking around. There's a satirical poem from the 14th century written by a monk from Kildare called The Abbot of Gloucester's Feast, and it describes in great detail the gluttony of abbot and friar, and how much they also ill-treat their inferiors. There's a very similar poem, just a bit less detailed, in a 15th century manuscript, where the writer is complaining that the abbot and the friar drink good and highly flavoured wine, whereas all of the monks and the nuns are only given the inferior stuff. And it's unclear at that point whether the complaint being made is that the abbot drinks too much, or that he's keeping all the good stuff for himself. And generally we are talking wine and beer, and variants thereof still. There are a few odd references suggesting that because they're doing so much brewing, they're getting more creative and inventive. A lot of that comes later as well. We can look at the early modern 16th, 17th, 18th centuries that continental monasteries invent a lot of different alcoholic herbal drinks, things that still have their followers, like a Benedictine or a Chartreuse. Buckfast, yes, of course, Buckfast is another good example of one that has continued from way back in this time. One of those very early ones mentioned is a Trappist monastery, and of course Trappist beer is still considered to be among the best beers in the world by people who know about these things. So there is this long tradition within monasteries of innovation and of producing different kinds of alcoholic drink. There's even one that might be one of the earliest references to something stronger in this country. Not this country, in Ireland. In the 12th century, Henry II's soldiers raided an Irish monastery, and it was said that they took from the monks some drink which burned their throats and got them very drunk. And people have argued whether this is just a particularly strong, maybe spiced ale, or whether the monks had actually cracked some sort of primitive distillation process, or somebody had brought back some of those ideas, because distillation was going on in Arabia and in the Middle East by this point, and whether they were producing very early whiskey. We don't know. What we can say is that the church cannot disassociate itself from booze at this point. Obviously, it happens in the Mass, it's what they're feeding their monks. And it's also, if you look at what ordinary churches are doing rather than what monasteries are doing, it's also one of the main sources of alcohol for ordinary people. Pretty much anyone can brew a small amount of ale. It doesn't require that much equipment. And even in late medieval period, the ale house or the tavern that we heard being railed about earlier, those are quite rare and in their infancy, and we'll, like I say, talk about them a bit next week. But the centre of the community isn't the pub, it's the church. And that includes the sale of beer. Most churches would be brewing their own, sometimes even brewing them in the church itself if they haven't got other suitable buildings. And they would sell it through the year when it happened to be done. And particularly they would tend to have a big event, like a big village fair, I guess, a village fete, called a church ale. The actual name of the event is a church ale. And at those they would sell the church ale. And this was a major source of revenue for a lot of the poorer churches, because people would turn up to the church ale and get absolutely hammered. And that was one of the easiest, ways to get hold of your booze. So that's a little bit about what the church was getting up to. Like I say, we will progress from there next time to how the pub first started, how the early ale house developed into, well, nowhere near what we know and love today, but developed into its own distinct, unique entity. Until then, don't drink a gallon of ale unless you really, really want to. And if you do, expect there to be a churchman getting cross with you somewhere. Good night, all. No.